One day in the summer of 1981, Go Suk-jong, in mid-40s, visited her husband's aunt's house in Daegu. The aunt, Yoon Kyung-hwa, was a fortune teller in 70s who was known as Wanyo Ro Bodhisattva to nearby residents. But that day, unlike usual, there was no answer from inside. And the more she stepped into the house, the more foul smell grew.
Aunt, are you at home, Kyung-yeon?
She called old lady Yoon and Kang Kyung-yeon, the housekeeper, in turn. But instead of answering, she witnessed a terrible sight. Inside the house, there were 3 bodies. Those are Aunt Yoon, housekeeper Kang, and Yoon's adopted daughter, Yoon Soo-young. And some furniture and objects were in a mess. After receiving a call from Go Suk-jong, the detective Ha Young-woon, who was directing the investigation at the scene, did not suspect Mrs. Go from the beginning. Based on his detective experience, she seemed far from the killer who had killed 3 people. However, during the search process, he intercepted a certificate of deposit of a very large amount that could be converted into cash from the scene. And soon, an evil desire grew in Young-woon's mind. He pointed up Go Suk-jong, the niece of old lady Yoon and the first witness, as a suspect. There was no evidence, but Ha Young-woon was confident. He gave his associates and superiors valuables and cash he had acquired at the house of old lady Yoon, and composed a confession he wanted to receive from Go Suk-jong. The police dragged Go Suk-jong, whom they identified as the suspect, to a hotel, stripped her clothes, and handcuffed her hands. Mrs. Go was put in a bathtub in that state, and water was poured over her nose and face, making it difficult for her to breathe, and she was beaten all over her body. In the end, she was tortured for several days until they made her spine disabled, and Go had no choice but to comply with her false confession as the detectives demanded. When Ha Young-woon sent her to the prosecutor's office, he threatened her once again.
If you reverse the confession, I'll take you back and electrically torture you. At that time, not only you but also your husband will not be safe. The prosecution is also on our side, so behave well.
In the first trial, the prosecutor and the lawyer confronted each other over the allegations against Go Suk-jong.
Go Suk-jong, the nephew of old lady Yoon, was enraged and killed Yoon when the old lady canceled her promise to buy Go Suk-jong an apartment. That's how Mrs. Go decided to pass on Yoon's legacy to her husband and children.
The defendant's husband was the chief of the prosecutor's office, and Go Suk-jong herself was a competent salesperson at an insurance company. Nevertheless, claims of such an extreme choice of her are far too unrealistic.
As the lawyer said, Go Suk-jong's husband was the chief of the prosecutor's office, and she was the daughter of a well-to-do family, and she graduated from prestigious university. Go Suk-jong, who persisted in her confession even in her media interviews, decided to speak in the courtroom that her confession had been fabricated under the torture. Therefore, when she went to her witness stand, there was an uproar, because people saw her bent over and walk unsteady.
Look at that! The cops tortured her to get the false confession so she can't even walk normally.
That's not true. She was originally a disc patient.
What are you talking about? That kind of disc patient killed many people like that.
From the first trial judgment, Go Suk-jong was able to compensate, albeit a little, for her injustice. Perhaps because of her defendant's background and the efforts of her lawyer, the judge acquitted Go Suk-jong. But this story doesn't end here. Detective Yang-woon, who urgently tried to cash in Yoon's certificate of deposit, was discovered by a bank employee who found it suspicious. Ha Young-woon was arrested for this, and other colleagues were fired or resigned. Their boss also resigned, and soon after, at the Daegu police station, the cops put on a performance to apologize for this incident. Heard the news of Ha Young-woon's arrest, Go Suk-jong suppressed her boiling anger and said,
I want him to suffer the same as I did.
The ex-cop Ha was released after 1 year and 6 months, and became the owner of a small restaurant near Namsan. And a reporter from a newspaper visited him. When the reporter asked who was the real culprit of the incident, Hall remained silent for a moment before saying like this.
Go Suk-jong. That woman is the killer.
Go Suk-jong and her family later won a lawsuit for compensation for the damages. Even at that time, the prosecutor in charge consistently insisted that Go Suk-jong was guilty, so after hearing the verdict, he stared blankly at the ceiling for a while. Unfortunately for the dead and the bereaved, Go Suk-jong and her family, this case was not focused on finding the real criminal from the beginning. At the time, the investigation of corruption and torture by the police threw the truth of the cruel killer into the labyrinth forever.